Information on the environment of the Great Basin, Student Handout 3.2a. Physical features. The Great Basin is a large desert region in the western United States bordered by the Sierra Nevada in the west and the Rocky Mountains in the east. Many shorter mountains break up the region. Between these low mountains are flat valleys. Some valleys may have lakes or sinks. Sinks are low areas where water may collect. The largest sinks are the Great Salt Lake, Carson, and Humboldt sinks, and Pyramid Lake. The area is called a basin because of the waters of its streams and rivers remain within it and do not drain out into the ocean. The streams and rivers either dry up as they cross the desert or empty into one of the basin's lakes. The Great Basin covers practically all of Utah and Nevada and parts of California, Idaho, Oregon, and Wyoming. Climate. The weather in the Great Basin is harsh. During the winter it may snow and the temperature may drop to below freezing. In the summer, temperatures can reach as high as 140 degrees Fahrenheit in places like Death Valley. The temperatures can be extreme not only from season to season but also from day to night, dropping by 25 degrees Fahrenheit after the sun sets. In the higher altitudes, strong winds can cause blinding dust storms. The high mountains to the east and west block rain clouds from reaching the basin skies. There is little rainfall, and evaporation of collected water is high. Water availability. There are a few large lakes and rivers in this region, such as the Great Salt Lake and the Humboldt River, but they are far apart. In the spring, small streams temporarily fill with water after the heavy rains, but these quickly disappear in the heat of the summer months. Animal life. There are many kinds of reptiles, birds, and mammals that live in this region, but they are scarce and difficult to find. Most of the mammals are small rodents like kangaroo rats and antelope jackrabbits. There are many kinds of snakes and lizards. The animals usually avoid the extreme midday heat by feeding at night after the temperature has dropped. Many small animals dig burrows underground and stay there during the day. Larger animals hide in the shade of bushes and shrubs. Vegetation. Few trees grow in the area, but desert shrubs cover the basin. One important desert plant is the yucca, which produces edible flowers and fruit during certain seasons of the year. Sagebrush, pinyon trees, and juniper trees are the other main plants found in the Great Basin. Native Americans in their environment, the Great Basin. Student Handout 3.2d. The people of the Great Basin had the hardest struggle for existence of any Native Americans on the continent. Once there were many lakes in the basin, but they dried up more than 1,000 years ago. It took so many square miles to provide food for each individual that these people had to live in small family groups that were widely scattered and constantly moving. One Native American group in the Great Basin was the Shoshone. Housing. The Shoshone lived in domed willow or brush wickups. Wickups were constructed by placing a number of small, pliable poles in a circle, bending them into the center, and tying the tops together to form an igloo shape. This structure was covered with slabs of bark, hides, or grass that were tied into place with willow branches. In harsher regions where building materials were scarce, the people lived in a circular framework of willow poles with bundles of tule reeds slanted toward the center, leaving the top open. Such a home looked like a cone without a top. Clothing. In the summer, the Shoshone wore as little as possible, which for men and children was ordinarily nothing. The women wore aprons made of woven sagebrush or cedar bark pounded into shreds. In the winter, this bark material was also woven into sleeveless pullovers and pants for men and blouses and skirts for women. Jackrabbit pelts were sewn together for cloaks or moccasins, although most people went barefoot. Food. Food was difficult to find in the basin, so anything that could provide nourishment was greatly revered. The Shoshone named groups of their people after particular foods that were important to the livelihood of each group and that was common to the area where they lived. Those living in the mountains were called sheep eaters. Others were called rabbit eaters and pine nut eaters. The most widely available vegetable food was the sweet pinyon nut of the pinyon pine. Jackrabbits were an important source of meat. Tribes throughout the region had rabbit drives where long nets made of yucca fiber were set up to capture rabbits that were driven from the surrounding area. Grasshoppers were also gathered to be roasted and ground into a powder that could be added to other foods for nourishment. Recreation. Most of every day was spent foraging and gathering food, but there was always time for games. Most games played in this region were gambling games, in which people bet their few belongings. They had little to lose. Most creative efforts went into practical objects like nets for catching game and baskets for gathering piñon nuts, berries, and seeds. Values. Ceremonies centered on the pines with prayer and blessings on the trees and expressions of thankfulness to the earth for providing food for the Shoshone survival. The Shoshone, like other Native Americans in the basin, structured their lives around the seasons because in the spring and summer food was more plentiful. In the fall there could be feasting, but in winter it might take a whole day of hunting to find one rabbit, and there were periods of starvation. Native Americans of the Great Basin. This is the textbook reading. To the east of California lies the Great Basin, a low area between the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains. The mountains on either side of this region block the rain, making this land mostly desert. The plants that grow in this area are those that need little water, such as low grasses, sagebrush, and craggy pinyon trees. Only small animals, such as rabbits and lizards, live in this harsh region. With limited food and water, only a few families could live in a place at one time. For this reason, people of the Great Basin traveled in small groups and spent much of their time looking for food. Extreme heat and cold. Wherever people camped, they made temporary shelters of willow poles shaped into a cone and covered with brush or reeds. Almost all year, they carried water in baskets coated with sap from pine trees. When winter came, temperatures dropped below freezing. To keep warm, people made robes out of rabbit hides. First, they twisted long strips of hide so that only the fur showed. Then they wove these strips on a willow loom. Each adult robe required about 100 rabbit skins. Searching for food. In this arid, dry environment, people followed food sources from season to season. In spring, they camped by valley lakes and streams swollen with melted snow. Men attracted migrating ducks with floating decoys made from reeds. When birds landed, the men chased them into nets. Meanwhile, women gathered duck eggs and tender shoots of cattail plants. When the streams dried up in the summer, Great Basin people enjoyed snakes and grasshoppers as treats. But mostly they ate plants, almost 100 kinds. Women used sharp sticks to dig up roots. To knock seeds loose from plants, they wove flat baskets called seed beaters. From the mountain slopes, they gathered ripe berries. In autumn, bands harvested pine nuts and hunted fat jackrabbits. As winter arrived, the Great Basin people bundled into their rabbit robes in the warmer hills. In huts and caves, they lived off food they had dried earlier, waiting for the ducks to return in spring. Caption says, life was difficult for Native Americans who lived in the Great Basin. Because of extreme temperatures and sparse rainfall, few plants and animals survived there.